Hosam, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. So you've recently, not very recently, but recent enough, you've sold Namshi, and you've now co-founded Tabby. Did you get some time to rest in between?
Unfortunately, not enough. The plan was for a much longer time off, but it did not materialize. So shortly after leaving, I started thinking about what was next. And when the opportunity for Tabby came up, unfortunately, I think for me, the timing was of the essence. So we jumped right into it. So I think all in all, I took about 2 to 3 weeks off between the two. And that was it after 8 years at Namshi. Yeah.
That's a pretty short vacation for having sold the company.
It wasn't much of a vacation.
So how did that come about? Like, did you just come across, or the idea came to you, or were you doing something that prompted that? How did that happen?
Sure. So, I came across buy now, pay later as a business model probably a few years before we started Tabby. And that was when we came across it in a sister company to Namshi's in Australia. They were using Afterpay, which was one of the first companies that got into the space and probably one of the most successful in the space right now. And that kind of stuck with me, and we thought, why can't we have something similar in the region? Actually, we were quite excited about doing using a similar process or a similar provider for Namshi. But neither Afterpay nor Klarna were coming to the region. And so, didn't really think about it beyond that. And then a couple of years later, I think the space really started to mature. And I thought, why not try to do it ourselves? And given the value that we saw that these guys were providing in other markets. I think the other driver for us, specifically for the region, was just the importance of solving for cash on delivery, given the prominence and the challenges with that cash on delivery presents. So we thought, buy now, pay later by design allows the customer to pay later, which is one of the key reasons why customers generally choose to pay by cash. And so, I think it's all kind of came together and it made sense.
How long did it take you from when you decided you want to kick this off until you actually did? What was the process?
So obviously there was a period where it was kind of an idea, and do I really want to do something straight away? And so I think that took some time, right, to get comfortable with the fact that we were going to step into another startup this quickly. So I think that was probably the most time-consuming piece of it all, where there was just that uncertainty on whether we wanted to do it so quickly. I think once we kind of decided, myself, my co-founder, that this is something that we wanted to get into, I think the decision was fairly straightforward. That I think that the entire kind of setup and trying to get things together and figure out the business model and figure out just the complexities of the region probably took another 2 months to put something together for.
And how is it going from, how many people were you at Namshi when you sold? Was it like 200, 500? How many people was there?
So we were closer to the 500. 500 people, including kind of operational staff. I think outside of operations, we were probably about 150.
So how is it to go from 500 people to, like, you're imagining 500 people to going to, 1 or 2 on your own, and then you have to do the smallest thing yourself again and all of this. Yeah. How did that feel? Did that feel exciting, or did you feel that
it's lonely?
Oh shit, I have to do it.
It's lonely, right? So I think one of the challenges is just the fact that you're on your own all of a sudden, and as you said precisely, right? Up until recently, I'm still releasing salaries myself, right? I'm going into the notary public and signing documents myself, and these are things that. Back when we had money and we had a big business, you had people do that for you. So it definitely is very different, and it's humbling to do that all over again. But honestly, it's part of building a business, right? And
did you feel a bit rusty going back to it in terms of like doing the small little stuff?
Absolutely, right. I guess the first time around, you're like, I need to do it. I don't have a choice. And now you're like, I could hire but let's not do that too early on. So up until today, we don't have an HR person. We don't have a PRO. And honestly, some of the things that we did at Namshi, we did probably earlier than we did over here because we had more money at Namshi.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a lot of things about Tabby, but before that, let's talk about how did you take Namshi from zero to sold in about seven years or 8 years, and you guys sold for I think around 250 million or something around that, which is there are not many startups in the region that have sold for such numbers. So tell us about the journey. How did it start, and how did it grow so fast and such a? And I remember I was probably one of the customers in Namshi in the early days, maybe 2013 or 14 when I moved to Dubai.
Yeah. So I mean we exited the business at the end at around the $300 million. So as you said, I think it was a fairly good exit for the region. And we were one of the only ones in the e-commerce space. I think outside of Sue, it was just ourselves at the time that had an exit. And so, I think the journey was quite incredible. I would say what we did differently is we just built lean very early on. We built a business where, despite the fact that we didn't really have control over ownership and ESOPs and employee compensation in terms of the structure of the business was slightly different at the time, as opposed to many of the businesses that started after us, where the ESOPs and things like that were under the control of the management. We still managed to make people feel that they were owners in the business, right? So there wasn't direct ownership per se, but the ownership was still there in terms of how people went about their everyday business. And I think that really mattered to us, and it meant a lot, right? Bringing on people that started as fresh grads and giving them ownership of a department or ownership of a product, and just letting them go with that, I think really mattered, right? Because we managed to get the best out of them. And some examples here is, right, we had a fresh grad out of the AUS. She came and joined us. No experience whatsoever in fashion or buying, and 3 years in, she was managing our entire private label, a $20 million budget just for her to go out and basically spend and buy product, right? And I think that was something that we were able to do because we set the business up in that way early on, and as opposed to a larger entity that has a bureaucracy in place and has a lot of just challenges in terms of allowing people to do what they want. I think that was a key component and allowed us to differentiate. So I would pin it down to just really hiring when needed and stretching people because of the fact that we weren't hiring too much. And at the same time, giving people full ownership and responsibility over their areas of ownership, and I think that made a lot of difference.
So you said you had early on in with Namshi, and you fundraise early at the beginning, or so how did you?
If you look at Namshi, it was a rocket business, right? So with a rocket business, the way that things kind of end up transpiring is they give you some money, and if you end up doing well or going in the right direction, then you get a bit more money. And if things don't go in the right direction, then they shut you down, right? And that's essentially kind of how we built a business. We built a business assuming we had no money, despite the fact that it was available to us if we needed it. But the assumption always in the back of our minds was you don't have any money, and let's see how much you can do without that money. Right. And so that was in everything that we did in terms of hiring, in terms of spending on marketing, spending on inventory. All the key cost components of the business were just managed very, very efficiently from day one, with the assumption that money was going to run out sooner or later.
Yeah. I really like the Basecamp model of hire when it hurts. So you shouldn't hire anyone until you feel that you really need that person. Otherwise, you can't get the job done.
And people need to feel stretched. I think when people have just a lot of room and a lot of time, then that just becomes the norm and the expectation, right? And then when you do stretch them, it becomes a bit of an abnormality. Whereas if people always have a lot to do, then that's when you get the best out of them, and it gets to the point of breaking when you hire the next person after that.
Yeah, and how do you ensure that when you start hiring and growing at a certain pace, which you did, and your business is very much customer-facing business, and it's a B2C business, so and everything kind of starts from within, and your culture on the inside reflects the culture on the outside. So how do you ensure that when hiring new people come in, that they follow that culture? I mean, you spoke a little bit yesterday about customer service and all of that. So how it's kind of you roll that down to everyone within the organization, so that they're up to that level of customer service, same culture, and so on.
Sure. So, and again, when I spoke about hiring to the point of breaking point, or not before breaking point, I think that applied everywhere except for where it really touched the customer, right? So, where the only area that we were really scaling headcount in the early years of the business was delivery, customer service, areas where the customer was directly impacted, as opposed to what you would call back office, which is buying, marketing, and all of those other parts of the business where the customer wasn't directly impacted, right? And those are the areas that we can stretch. But back to your question, yeah, I think it was when we came in, when we started Namshi, and you looked out into the competition, there was very little attention to customer experience in the region. I think it's very different where it is today. I think customer experience is becoming a lot more at the forefront, and people understand the value of that in building a brand and building a business. However, when we started in 2011, that wasn't the case at all. Right? We had some competitors that were promising delivery dates of 25 days. Right? Their promise to the customer was, "We'll get you the order in 25 days." Right?
Thank you.
Yeah. And that wasn't always met. So when you come in and you identify that gap, I think it's essential. And it wasn't just essential because we wanted to please the customer. I think it was essential because that's the only route to success. And obviously we had other role models in the e-commerce space that proved that, right? I think if you look at Zappos and if you look at ASOS in other markets, they proved, and Amazon obviously as up there, they proved that the only sustainable way of building a business is by ensuring that the customer is happy.
Did you ever outsource that?
Did I ever? Sorry, what was that?
Did you ever outsource customer service, or do you think?
So yeah, I think we outsourced early on to areas which maybe it was right to outsource them for the short term until we were able to insource them, but definitely not a long-term solution. And that was warehousing, delivery, and customer service, right? So those were all sitting somewhere else and with a 3PL, probably for about 6 to 9 months, our first 6 to 9 months of the business. And we started insourcing them one by one. So the first thing we brought in is customer service. That was relatively easy. After that, we brought in warehousing, and that was important, right? It was taking our 3PL 2 days to ship an order, whereas we thought we could do a much better job. And then finally, we insourced delivery. And I think that's the most challenging thing to insource. And it's also not something that you need to insource in other markets. So in markets where delivery providers are capable and can scale, that's not something that e-commerce companies generally do.
So how did you go about the decision to do that? Because I think even here, a lot of e-commerce players still also outsource that as well. So, for someone who's starting up an e-commerce startup today, how do they decide, given that also it's very CapEx heavy, it's including warehousing and it's quite high cost. Why did you decide that, and do you recommend it for others as well, still today in the region? This was back in 2000 and
and I think that's a key difference, right? So if you look at where things are today, I think the capabilities are much better than they were back then, right? There are providers that will do a fairly decent job. I think then the question becomes if they're able to address your service requirements on the service side, then it just becomes a cost question, right? However, for us, it wasn't just a cost question. It was much more, and I think it was probably more expensive in the short term, but was a lot more about quality and service quality, right? So in order to be able to deliver to a customer in a day or 2 days in the UAE, you had to in-source warehousing and probably also delivery. Today, I think that's less an issue. And so I think, the question goes back to when someone's looking at it today, if the quality is being addressed, then it just becomes a question of cost. And I think if you're looking at it purely from a cost perspective in the short term, while the company's not at scale, it probably doesn't make the most sense.
So one thing I remember when I used Namshi, maybe for the first time or like the first few times, something that I really liked was, especially, this was several years back, the way everything was presented, the way, you check out the different items, you had like, all the photos looked, perfect. They looked like creative. They had it looked like it appealed, to younger audience, and a certain modern style. How did that come about? Was that something that, you decided on from like day one? That's how I want it to look like? Was it out of personal taste or something else that you saw?
Sure. Well, I guess, I mean, if you ask me how it looked like 7 years ago versus where it looks like today, it's we would not have been very happy with what it looked like 7 years ago, right? So that was something that was constantly evolving, and we wanted to, and then at the end of the day, a lot of I mean, you ask a lot of e-commerce providers, and it's just images, right? And it's just pictures. What difference does it make? But we really felt that image is what the customer saw, and that's how they kind of appreciated what Namshi had to offer. Was at the end of the day, they are buying an image, right? You're buying a fashion product, and therefore you are buying an image. That needed to up to a certain standard. And so, I think again, you look at what's around and you realize that what is around isn't that great. And then you look outside and you see areas where other companies are doing an incredible job there, right? And one thing that I think, consistently did at Namshi, and I think we're consistently doing right now in my new business, is looking for who are these companies that are best practice? Who are these companies that are doing an amazing job? And let's try to set them as a standard, as a role model for us across the entire business. And I don't think it's anything to be shy about, right? So early on at Namshi, we looked at ASOS and we said, that's a business that we want to look like. They have a great customer experience. They have a great image. They have a great brand, and their customers love them. Let's try to learn from them what they do best. And if there are areas that we can improve on, then let's improve on those further. But from the areas that you just mentioned, I think in terms of look and feel, in terms of customer experience, in terms of the assortment itself and how it appealed to the young consumer, they were definitely a role model for us. And that was fairly clear across the entire business.
So in a lot of things, you looked at ASOS or other players and you're like, okay, this works there, so it must work here. And do you remember like that day when you looked at their website and you were like, okay, this looks really good. Let's, and you went to someone on the team and you were like, let's look at this. That's how we need to be. And you guys went and did that in this way, or was that before you started Namshi? That
it definitely wasn't before we started. I think before you start, you think everything, a lot of that stuff just comes naturally, right? And then you look at the output, and it's clear that it doesn't. And honestly, I mean, for fashion e-commerce, photography is a very challenging thing to get right. And I think we invested a lot in it. We invested a lot on the people side, but also in terms of equipment and consultants and things like that. Obviously, that's not something you can do on day one, right? So you make do with what you can, with what you have. And then when the time is right and you feel it makes sense to start investing in it, then you do. So initially it was just, let's improve the look and feel and the product photography. then it became, okay, let's invest in higher quality models. So we started bringing in models from the UK. We started flying in models from all over the place. And yeah, these are not things that directly translate into sales, right? You can't put a dollar value on them. But when you look at this image that we wanted to present, I think it was an important component of it.
Yeah, this is a very important thing you mentioned here, which almost every founder goes through, is that, we were talking a bit earlier about when you need to be, lean and need to make sure your cost is, when it hurts and whatever. At the same time, you need to also know when you can be cheap and you need to go for the premium and overspend. And a lot of people do mistakes in that. They think, they think there's only one rule. You need to go cheap on everything and cut costs. But it's, from your experience with Namshi, it was clearly that it was a mix of the two. And it was about deciding, did someone, for example, at that time from Rocket or someone else say, why are you spending that amount of money on models and, great photographers and whatever? How's that translating into sales? How did you evaluate that from your point of view? How do you evaluate it?
It's an evolution, right? It's important that it is an evolution. It can't just be from day one. You want to have everything be top notch. I think the idea is you need to evolve there and you need to get there, and it's a constant evolution, right? I told you the images 7 years ago were definitely not where the images were today. But I think 7 years ago we were relatively happy with where they were. Right? So, so I don't think there was anyone that came to us and said, "Why are you investing in it?" Having said that, I think once you have a board and once you have investors that come on board, you need to justify a lot of the investments that you're making, and so it becomes a lot easier to justify these things. When things are looking good. When things are not looking good, it's very difficult to justify a spend on a higher quality model or a higher quality image.
And I think in some way or the other, you need to kind of figure out as a founder what makes your brand and what you're doing stand out. So I think maybe at least from for me as on the consumer side and seeing Namshi, the kind of like UI experience of the website and the images and the brand, I felt that although the products you had were not very expensive, so they were fairly, very well priced, but I felt like I'm buying a premium, product, which really added the value. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so we talk about some of the soft stuff, right, and the soft stuff that we made investments in. Obviously, there's a lot of things that go behind the scenes on the product itself, right? The app was something that we invested very, very heavily in. The speed of the app, the infrastructure that's behind it, and these are all investments that we justified by direct impact on the customer. So the biggest question that we would ask ourselves on any project that we would do at Namshi is, what is the impact on the consumer? And if that was not clear, then that investment wasn't made, right? Because for any founder, any entrepreneur, what they're going to be faced with is decisions on prioritizing. You're going to be hit with 100 different ideas and 100 different priorities, and you need to prioritize and decide what is important for you today versus what can wait. And I think the only way where it makes sense to try to figure out prioritization is via customer impact. What, this project versus that project, which impacts my consumer more versus which doesn't.
I want to ask you, I know you are still related to e-commerce. You're not, you're on a different side now with Tabby. But given your experience within e-commerce, and a lot of, founders in the region are either existing e-commerce founders, or, there's also more verticals that people are still going into. If you were to start, within a vertical or an e-commerce business today, as Hosam in Dubai or the Middle East, I want to go over different areas. If you can tell me what are certain things that, you would go with if you were to start a company today. So let's start with the operation side. So, and I think some of the people in the audience are asking about that as well. So on delivery, warehousing, and customer service, for each of these, can you tell me who, if you know specific names as well, who would you choose as a partner? How would you still do it in-house? Same thing for the other stuff.
It's difficult to name partners over here. I think there's a lot of players in the space. I think there's a lot of players that haven't really evolved and matured, despite the fact that they've been around for a very long time. I would probably look at some of the more recent startups in the space and try to see what they can do for us, because they're just a lot more technologically advanced. They're a lot more hungry for business, and they'll serve some of the smaller businesses. But the question on do you outsource, do you insource? Again, it really comes down to what are your priorities today versus what should they be 3 or 4 years from now. I think for many startups, unless their business is the core of their business is delivery, then they should probably look at figuring out ways in which they can outsource.
On the tech side, would you go with platforms like Shopify or other platforms to kick off your e-commerce business today, or would you build your own? I believe back in the day you probably built your own in one way or the other.
Yeah, I think if you look at where we are today, a lot of the platforms are a lot more advanced than where they used to be, and they can support much bigger businesses. I think in the short term, to give you the opportunity, the speed to market and the opportunity to scale easily and test easily, I would probably go for an existing platform. And then if the need requires it at a later stage, then you build. But yeah, I think it's a heavy investment to build that all from scratch today, especially if time to market is important.
Okay. On payments, and try to be objective here. I know you're at Tabby now, so how would you put the order in terms of priority of what you should have as a payment enablement within a new e-commerce, even in the first 6 months to 1 year? Like if you can list them in the order.
I'm not going to say that buy now, pay later should be the top of your decision or the number one thing that you look at, right? The number one thing you want to enable is just a proper payment gateway that accepts cards within the region and is technologically sound. And so, yeah, there are multiple options in the market already, and a lot of strong local players in the space. I think there's quite a few actually, and it's difficult to look across them and try to figure out the differences. But I think it really the question should come down to two key things: is how important will we be for this payment gateway as a client, right? So some payment gateways just don't want to work with small businesses; they don't want to work with startups. And then, what's the kind of integration complexity, and then how does it sit on my e-commerce platform? But yeah, I think payment gateway is definitely the first question that you need to ask. And funny enough, we used to get asked that question a lot in the early days of Namshi. What's your payment gateway? And back in 2012, that was probably the least of our concerns, right? It was 85% of our orders were cash on delivery. It really did not matter what 15%, where 15% of orders went. But now I think things are clearly changing. We're close to 50, 40, 50, 60%, depending on the vertical of digital payments. So I think the decision on the choice of payment gateway is quite important.
Okay, and what about things like Apple Pay and other enablements? When should an e-commerce founder think about these things, and how should they prioritize when to have that? Have you seen a significant
evolution? Right. I think the most basic is let me have a functioning website where people can transact and I can deliver. Right. That's kind of basic. Number one, it needs to work, and I need to be able to sell, and I need to be able to get the product to the customer. Then you start to kind of optimize further on, okay, how do I optimize spend on marketing? How do I optimize delivery cost? How do I improve page load speed? Do I build an app? And so on and so forth. I think on after that is, can I add additional payment methods? And this is where kind of maybe the buy now, pay later. Do I need to add that? Do I need to add Apple Pay? Do I need to add local payment methods in each market that I'm in? These kind of are, I would say, depending on the markets, they become at that stage a lot more important. So in Saudi, you probably wouldn't want to launch an e-commerce business without having access to Maté as the local debit card scheme. In the UAE, it really doesn't matter. You start a local payment gateway where you can accept cards, and you're fine.
On next one is growth. So probably that's an important part of getting customers in and acquiring users. And today the landscape is quite competitive. There's a lot of players. You're competing with big boys and small boys everywhere. So how would you go about that today if you have an e-commerce business in terms of customer acquisition and spending on acquiring customers?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a very, very broad topic.
Try to dig deeper if you can.
So, I mean, again, I think early on, the expectation should be that spend will be inefficient. It'll be highly, highly inefficient. And why? It's because a lot of the things that I spoke about, which are secondary and tertiary, haven't come into play yet, which is, you don't have the assortment where you need it. And let's maybe focus on e-commerce for a second, right? You're trying to sell product. You haven't understood what your customer wants. You don't have enough of that assortment. You don't have enough breadth, just know-how on what sells on your website. And that is, again, an evolution. You're not going to get that from in the early days. You're going to learn and develop your understanding of consumer demand and what they're looking for. And if you do go out and say that you want to be this big in year one, therefore you're going to have to invest in buying a lot of inventory that for many reasons might end up not selling, right? So there is a significant investment that you would need to make there. So I think in everything that I would kind of consider with regards to growth, it needs to be very phased. I think if there's very few noon.coms that can come in and say we're going to be big on year one, right? In year one, I think for pretty much everyone else, that understanding needs to be that I can't be that big in year one. I need to get there eventually because I need to be efficient on my spend. My spend on inventory, my spend on marketing, my spend on hiring, on all these components. It needs to be kind of a constant learning approach of how do I continue to optimize and learn and develop rather than getting there immediately.
And how do you know what's missing in the market or what the customers in general are looking for? Do you start by, thinking of, okay, there's a gap? What do customers need, and walk back towards having the products? Or let me put out some products that I think will do well and people need, and see if people will buy or not. And then if they don't, and also, versus having your own inventory or working with partners and providing these things.
So I guess, a question maybe on marketplace versus buying, right? And just making everything available to your customer versus you buying it yourself does come down to the investment that you're willing to make and how much capital you have. As what we did differently at Namshi versus, say, the Amazons and the Moos of the world is we had to buy the inventory because we wanted to ensure that we were able to address the demands of our customers with a lot of control. We needed to ensure that we had that product if the customers were looking for it. And whenever we did that on Marketplace, or we tried to do that on Marketplace, that we weren't very successful there. So the nice thing about, let's say, in terms of buying your own inventory for a fashion retailer, you can follow demand very quickly. So you see something sells, you go out into the market and buy more and more and more of it. And then next year, when you know that thing is going to sell again, you just buy early on and you ensure that you have enough of it, as opposed to going back into the market and not finding that anymore, right? Because everyone's looking for it. So maybe a silly example or a simple example for what happened during COVID, right? What happened during COVID is there was a massive demand on swimming pools, indoor swimming or household swimming pools for the home, and pumps for the swimming pools. And these marketplaces were sharing the same supply from a handful of swimming pool sellers in the market. And within a month, we sold out of swimming pools in the UAE. And what ends up happening, obviously, is that you're not able to keep up with the demand, and you're missing a huge opportunity on sales. Now, obviously, nobody's going to predict that there was going to be a spike in swimming pools, but the alternative, when you have inventory and there is an ability to predict demand, then you're just stocking up on swimming pools early on, and the opportunity for growing that is significant. And so where we have that, and an example we go back to a lot, is back to school for Namshi. We knew that every year there was going to be a massive spike in sales of backpacks, and we knew what backpacks they were going to be. So which size backpack, which color backpack, and therefore we just bought every backpack in the market early on, and we ensured that we had that stock, as opposed to people that were sharing that stock across a number of retailers, where they could only meet, they'll sell out of backpacks, but they'll sell out of a very small number of backpacks. Right.
So that's interesting.
With your answer to your question, but so that's kind of a point on marketplace versus inventory, which is quite important.
I want to talk more about Tabby, which is your new venture. So with Tabby, who's your role model in the US or in the West? Who do you look at today? Who do you go on their website, research, and try to see what they're doing and try to implement here?
Yeah. So I think, with Tabby, maybe for people that don't know what Tabby is, so we are a buy now, pay later business. We offer customers the ability to buy from online and offline retailers in installments or in deferred payments. So you go into checkout just as you would any other checkout, and you select Tabby as a payment method, and you're able to split your purchase into
without any interest, right?
No cost. So you're basically the merchant is bearing the cost of that transaction for you, or of that financing for you. And the reason the merchant would do that is because the merchant will sees that as a customer acquisition tool, right? It's a great way to improve conversion on their site, because what they're able to do is give their customers installments, which for many consumers, that transaction at the point of sale is an obstacle that they need to overcome.
Like a discount.
Yeah. So, and it's cheaper than a discount, right? That's what I like about buy now, pay later as a retailer, is it's much cheaper for me than offering a discount. And so that's what we've done. We launched the business earlier in the year on a number of websites across the region, both in the UAE and Saudi, and more recently we launched in store as well with Ace Hardware and Toys R Us, and we're looking at expanding that soon. So yeah, back to your question on who do we look to? And again, we go back to at Namshi, we had ASOS over here. We're lucky to have two very strong players in the space globally. One is Afterpay in Australia, and the other is Klarna in Sweden. They've built what you can call a cult following, right? Their customers are religious about using these payment methods across for every transaction that they make. And the reason is, again, it's a very attractive brand. It's they've made consumer finance sexy, which is not easy to do, right? And I think that's something to aspire to. So we look to these guys. We look at learning from what they've done. Not just from a branding perspective, but just who do they target in terms of consumers, in terms of merchants. And then obviously you try to evolve beyond that, right? You try to address the needs of the local market. So neither of these players in their markets have cash on delivery as a challenge, right? Cash on delivery is not an issue in Australia, and it's definitely not an issue in Europe. However, for us it is. And so we've tried to adapt that space to the needs of the local market as well.
So generally, it's I think there's a lot of business and the successful ones that have exited here. It's been about most of the business model itself. Usually, if it worked in the US or somewhere else, it's going to work here at the right time, obviously. So you need to time the market right. Yeah. And then you need to localize as well in certain ways, whether it's solving certain local challenges or brand and so on. How does the model work, by the way, for you? So from a user point of view, as a consumer, I don't pay anything. I just split my payments into different. I can pay them in installments. But how does it work for you? Does the merchant pay you a fee, or is it like a subscription, or?
Yeah. So the idea here, and what's important, is to ensure that the cost is on the merchant for a number of reasons, right? I think the market just becomes significantly smaller if you're only offering this to customers who are willing to pay an interest or who are willing to pay a cost, as opposed to if you tell the consumer that this is free for you, then your market is everybody, right? There is no consumer. There's very few consumers that would say, "Yeah, I don't want to pay for this in installments for free, and I don't need to think about it again because you're just going to charge me automatically every month," right? So I think when you make that value proposition for the customer very clear and very, and it's an easy decision, then the market becomes significantly bigger. And so yes, we push that cost onto the merchant, and then the question becomes how do you present value, and how do you make sure that the value is that clear to the merchant, where they're willing to pay that premium over a regular credit card transaction, right? Because number one question that we do get is, yeah, but I pay X for a credit card. Why should I pay you double that? And I think and then it becomes down to us to ensure that we're very clear on what that value proposition to the merchant is.
Essentially, eventually, for consumers, because there's also the option of paying your credit card in different installments. I get called by the bank all the time asking for that, but obviously it comes with a lot of interest. So does your business model in one way or the other compete with banks and kind of threaten some of the banks' business model, which is a challenge here as well. And there's been, different stories about, these different regulation issues over in the region.
And so I think the banks are always going to be challenged unless they evolve, right? If it's not us in the credit space, then it's somebody else in the payment space and the remittances and so on. So I think it's down to the banks to continue to try to be to stay ahead of the curve or along with the curve.
Banks are too old; they have to change.
Yeah, so I guess the good thing is the conversation is starting to happen, right? The banks are realizing that they need to change things. I think the banks that realize that they can't build everything there on their own are the ones that are probably going to remain relevant. I think if they believe that this is competitive and we need to go and crush them either via regulation or via trying to do it ourselves, then I think the success is going to be fairly limited there. Right, so we've had a number of banks come to us and say, "Let's partner." And they realize, right? It's not that we are so much smarter than them. We're not, but we're just a lot more flexible. We're a lot more agile, and we're able to do things a lot quicker. And so they come to us and say, "Let's partner in a number of ways." So we had a recent partnership with Fab, where we launched our product into the stores of Toys R Us and Ace Hardware, with Fab providing the hardware infrastructure, and all of a sudden they've become a player in the buy now pay later space. If they wanted to build this themselves, they could have, right? But it would have just taken them a lot more time. So I think that partnership and the understanding of the importance of these partnerships is starting to become a lot more valid in the region, and we hope that continues to evolve.
Yeah. Rami from the audience is asking an important question, which is, your kind of business, one, it needs a lot of cash, which is raised recently a good chunk of money for that. And the other thing is risk. There's quite a high risk. So how do you, if someone defaults on the payment, happens often in the UAE, or, different things could happen, and there are these risks. Who bears these risks? Is it you? Is it the merchant? What happens if someone defaults, and so on?
Yeah. So I think, again, back to the question of us going to the merchant with a value proposition. I think if we went to the merchant and said, "We're going to do this for you, but you guys bear the risk," it really loses all its appeal, right? There is no reason why a merchant would want to take that risk. because then they could just do it themselves and take that risk.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So we need to go to them with a full proposition on us taking the risk, us collecting from the customer, and ensuring that they get paid. So yes, it is a very expensive proposition here. We do, and it's a working capital intensive business, right? So the good thing is, I guess, in terms of pure P&L burn, it's not the same as an e-commerce company where you're burning cash regularly. Over here, it's just constant working capital as you grow this business. So we're having to pay the merchant before we collect from the customer. And hence the need for raising large amounts of money at an early stage. But then we go back to as well partnering with the banks. The banks are looking for ways to diversify their lending lines. They're looking for additional revenue streams. And the one thing they do have is capital, right? So we're working with banks as well on allowing them to lend through us to customers. And that's a relatively cheap source of capital for us that allows us to scale this business while we raise equity to manage, to kind of support the
technology and
the operations. Yeah. And again, also on customers that default, yes. Unfortunately, some customers do default, but that's kind of a part of the business model.
Do you have an insurance for that? Can you get an insurance?
I mean, I don't know if there are any insurance products out there that do this, but I think if there were, then they'd be too expensive and it wouldn't make sense anyway. But for us, if you look back at e-commerce as well, offering COD was an expensive proposition, but you just bake that into your business model that in order for me to be able to scale this business, I'm going to have to offer COD, and I'm going to have to lose a lot of money on shipping orders to customers that don't pick up these COD orders, right? Similarly over here, in order to scale this business, you're going to have to take risk. And if you don't take risk, then you don't grow this business. And the cost of that risk is eventually some people don't pay. Now there are repercussions and so on, but still, needless to say, some people will not pay.
And do you have different deals with the merchants? Is it like based on, you pay based on how many, if I pay you, fully in advance, or I split it? So where's the core challenge? Is it in how you pay your merchants and managing cash flow, or is it, what you charge?
Well, I think cash flow is probably a big challenge over here, because you do need to scale considerably, and you need to show your merchants that you're sufficiently capitalized as well, right? Because it is a risk on the merchant to work with a buy now, pay later player that runs out of money. Right? So if you get into too many doors and you're starting to scale very quickly, and then you don't have the cash to support that, then that risk sits on your partner. So it's important for us to very early on show these merchants that we have the capital to support the growth of their businesses. So I think that's, and I would say that is the core of this business, is really managing treasury and ensuring that you're always sufficiently capitalized to manage and support the growth of your partners.
You need to have a good CFO. Do you have one already, or that needs to grow? Is it like a team of, or you need like a genius to manage that? What do you need?
You need a strong CFO, and he's on the way.
Okay, good. What are some of the things that Klarna and others are facing? How much did they fundraise? So does that give you a kind of a roadmap to how much you need to fundraise? Are they facing challenges on the defaults and the different risks that come with this business that you need to, be careful about? What are you seeing that's happening elsewhere?
I'd say fundraising is always going to be a challenge if things are not looking good. But if the business is performing and risk is in check, then they're able to raise. And all these guys have seen incredible growth over the last couple of years, where fundraising hasn't been a challenge. And there's been a huge number of banks that were willing to support their growth, right? And the likes of Goldman and JP and a bunch of other banks have been very interested and keen on the buy now, pay later space, and they've opened up their lines to all these players. But I think the one thing that we all need to understand is there is a balance between growth and risk in this business, right? So the example here is Klarna went to the US, and Klarna for the first time ever saw losses on their P&L. And the reason is because they went into the US trying to grow and needing to grow their customer base very quickly. And obviously the cost to that is you end up taking more risk than you'd like, right? So there is a balance, and we need to be very careful on how we strike that balance between growth and risk. And as long as that's being balanced the right way, then I think the opportunity is very, very exciting.
How has it been being on the merchant side, on your e-commerce coming from Namshi, and now you are on a daily basis working with a lot of them? So you kind of had to switch hats. Has that helped you in some way? Do you get frustrated? Do you?
No, I mean, you always the grass is always greener. So when we were doing a B2C business, we said, "Oh, B2B is easy. I wish we could deal with a handful of merchants." And then now you look back and you're like, "Wow, that was so much easier." So I think both have their challenges. Over here, I think the complexity that is added even further for our business in Buy Now, Pay Later is you're having to manage both. We have to work with merchants and keep them happy, and we also have to work with customers and keep them happy. And so our customer experience team is actually both supports both customers and merchants and vendors to us. But one of the things that really has come into handy for us at Tabby is the fact that many of these merchants are merchants that I dealt with in the past at Namshi, and there are suppliers, there are retailers that we've partnered with extremely well at Namshi and spent years buying from. And the relationships existed, and the relationships were quite strong. So that really helped us getting into a number of doors early on and to scale this business.
So going from B2C to B2B, how do you go about growth today? That's a very different game than B2C. Is it more outreach kind of model, you to the merchants, or how you're building that cult and community as well that you saw Klarna and others do, and you want to replicate here? Yeah.
Now, I think over here, I guess the sequencing is slightly different. So we need to build a strong base of consumers early on that we're acquiring via the merchants. We're not acquiring ourselves because it'll probably be very inefficient for us to go out and acquire customers directly because the only way that they can transact is on a merchant website, right? So we're sequencing it slightly differently. We get to build our customer base through the merchants that we work with today, and then over time really start investing in the brand and acquiring new customers for our merchants, which we're going to get to fairly soon. And then you start to look at the likes of Klarna and Afterpay on what they're doing well over there, right? So they built a lot on the consumer side, but I doubt that that's how they got into the business, and I'm fairly certain that they didn't start off that way.
Do you see Tabby going into spaces other than e-commerce? For example, I don't know, my rent, I can pay in installments through you or something else. There's a lot of different services.
Honestly, I think there's a number of very interesting use cases for installments with what we're doing. So one is, as you mentioned, I think things like services are very interesting. We've tried a few already. We've gone into car insurance, which is not a typical e-commerce transaction, but it's actually been extremely appealing for consumers. We've done some online education, so English language courses and marketing courses and things like that, where customers normally would need to spend and put that expenditure up front. We're splitting that up for them. I think there's a number of use cases. Internationally, there's players that focus on flights and travel, right?
Yeah.
And that could be an interesting use case as well in this market. So definitely, I think there's a lot of different opportunities that we can start looking at.
Help me understand where the money is coming from here. So obviously the consumer is winning, which is great, and that's what tech helps in a lot of ways. And it's important that consumer makes the biggest gains in that regard. But where's that money coming from? So, because before, if you want to split up into different payments, then you need to pay interest. There's cost that comes with it. Now for consumers, doing it for free. So where is that, what was supposed to be interest kind of covering for? So the merchant is paying something for it, but where is that money? Is it coming? So is the loser like the marketing budget that you're spending it on Google Ads and other things, and you're acquiring now users organically?
I think that's a good way of looking at it, right? I think so. One area could be lower marketing spend, right? Because at the end of the day, this is a customer acquisition tool, right? I don't want to. We prefer not to call it a payment tool. It's a customer acquisition tool, and therefore, how do you acquire customers today? You acquire customers either via spending a bit more on marketing or discounting, right? And if we allow merchants to discount less, or we help them discount less, then I think they're benefiting. Because the issue with a discount is it's very difficult to get out of discounting, and it's a slippery slope once you get into discounting. And so, if the alternative is rather than discount your product, how about you just split your payments into multiple installments? How about you give the customer the ability to split their payments into multiple installments, and the net effect is the same, then this is much cheaper for them than discounting.
The last question, we're running out of time, is what is next for Tabby and for you, and what is something you'd want to leave us with today?
So, I mean, for us, it's next, right? It's amazing. We've been operational for just 6 months. So I think it is really right now focusing on expanding our reach within the markets that we're in, and just solidifying our customer experience and ensuring that the experience is top notch, right? Because the last thing that we want to do is acquire customers and then disappoint them. So we will probably take a slight step back on growth in the short term to ensure that we address every touch point with the consumer and make sure that is top notch. And then I think it's back to expansion from then on, right? Is it be it into new product lines, new markets, whatever you want to call it. But I think we don't want to do that before we've ensured that we've addressed our consumer touch points.
Hosam, thank you very much. Thanks for the audience that joined us live today. This will be available also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So you can also, and on Step Plus also, which we launched recently, which has a bunch of different content as well. The main aim of Maté Conversations is for founders and successful founders to share these detailed stories and things they're going to with other founders that are starting up or already and are in their business. Hosam, thank you very much. This was great.
Thanks for having me, Ray. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you like this podcast and want to listen to more episodes, subscribe to the Maté Conversations podcast on one of your favorite podcast channels.